SEER techniques are based on abusive tactics used by our enemies. If we use those same techniques offensively against detainees, it says to the world that they have America's stamp of approval. That puts our troops at greater risk of being abused if they're captured. It also weakens our moral authority and harms our efforts to attract allies to our side in the fight against terrorism. So how did SEER techniques come to be considered by DOD for detainee interrogations? In July of 2002, Richard Schifrin, a Deputy General Counsel in the Department of Defense and a witness at today's hearing, called Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Baumgartner, also a witness today, and then Chief of Staff at JPRA, which is the agency that oversees the SEER training, and asked for information on SEER techniques. In response to Mr. Schifrin's request, Lieutenant Colonel Baumgartner drafted a 2-page memo and compiled several documents, including excerpts from SEER instructor lessons plans, and he attached to his memo saying that JPRA would, quote, continue to offer exploitation assistance to those government organizations charged with the mission of gleaning intelligence from enemy detainees, close quote. The memo was hand-delivered to the General Counsel's office on July 25, 2002. Again, it's critical to remember that these techniques are not used in SEER school to obtain intelligence. They are to prepare our soldiers to resist abusive interrogations. The next day, Lieutenant Colonel Baumgartner drafted a second memo, which included 3 attachments. One of those attachments listed physical and psychological pressures used in SEER resistance training, including sensory deprivation, sleep disruption, stress positions, waterboarding, and slapping. It also made reference to a section of the JPRA instructor manual that talks about coercive pressures like keeping the lights on at all times and treating a person like an animal. Another attachment, written by Dr. Ogrisseg, also a witness today, assessed the long-term psychological effects of SEER resistance training on students and the effects of the waterboard. This morning, the committee will have the chance to ask Mr. Schifrin, Lieutenant Colonel Baumgartner, and Dr. Ogrisseg about these matters. On August 1, 2002, a week after Lieutenant Colonel Baumgartner sent his memos to the DOD General Counsel, the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel issued 2 legal opinions. One, commonly known as the first Bybee memo, was addressed to the then White House counsel Alberto Gonzalez and provided OLC's opinion on standards of conduct and interrogation required under the federal torture statute. The memo concluded that, quote, for an act to constitute torture, as defined in the statute, it must inflict pain that is difficult to endure. Physical pain amounting to torture must be equivalent in intensity to the pain accompanying serious physical injury, such as organ failure, impairment of bodily function, or even death. For purely mental pain or suffering to amount to torture under the federal torture statute, it must result in significant psychological harm of significant duration, e.g. lasting for months or even years. The other OLC opinion, issued the same day and known commonly as the second Bybee memo, responded to a CIA request and addressed the legality of specific interrogation tactics. While the interrogation tactics reviewed by the OLC in the second Bybee memo remain classified, General Hayden, in public testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee in February, said that the waterboard was one of the techniques that the CIA used with detainees. Stephen Bradbury, the current Assistant Attorney General of for the OLC, testified before the House Judiciary Committee earlier this year that, quote, CIA's use of waterboarding procedure was adapted from the SEER training program. During the time the DOD General Counsel's office was seeking information from JPRA, JPRA staff, responding to a request from Guantanamo, were finalizing plans to conduct training for interrogation staff from U.S. Southern Command's Joint Task Force 170 at Gitmo. During the week of September 16, 2002, a group from Gitmo, including interrogators and behavioral scientists, traveled to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and attended training conducted by instructors from the JPR SEER school. None of the 3 JPRA personnel who provided the training was a trained interrogator. On September 25th, just days after the Gitmo staff returned from that training, a delegation of senior administration lawyers, including Jim Haynes, General Counsel to the Department of Defense, John Rizzo, Acting CIA General Counsel, David Addington, Counsel to the Vice President, and Michael Chertoff, Head of the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice, visited Guantanamo. An after-action report produced by a military lawyer after the visit noted that one purpose of the trip was to receive briefings on intel techniques. On October 2, 2002, a week after John Rizzo, the acting CIA General Counsel, visited Gitmo, a second senior CIA lawyer, Jonathan Fredman, who was chief counsel to the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, went to Guantanamo, attended a meeting of Gitmo staff, and discussed a memo proposing the use of aggressive interrogation techniques. That memo had been drafted by a psychologist and psychiatrist from Gitmo who a couple of weeks earlier had attended that training given at Fort Bragg by instructors by the SEER School. While the memo remains classified, minutes from the meeting where it was discussed are not. Those minutes clearly show that the focus of the discussion was aggressive techniques for use against detainees. When the Gitmo Chief of Staff suggested at the meeting that Gitmo can't do sleep deprivation, Lieutenant Colonel Beaver, Gitmo's senior lawyer, responded, "Yes, we can," with approval. Lieutenant Beaver added that Gitmo, quote, "may need to curb the harsher operations while the International Committee of the Red Cross is around." Mr. Fredman, the senior CIA lawyer, suggested that it's, quote, "very effective to identify detainee phobias and to use them," and described for the group the so-called wet towel technique, which we know is waterboarding. Mr. Fredman said, quote, "it can feel like you're drowning. The lymphatic system will react as if you're suffocating, but your body will not cease to function," close quote. And Mr. Fredman presented the following disturbing perspective of our legal obligations under our anti-torture laws, saying, quote, "it is basically subject to perception. If the detainee dies, you're doing it wrong." If the detainee dies, you're doing it wrong. How on earth did we get to the point where a senior U.S. government lawyer would say that whether or not an interrogation technique is torture is, quote, "subject to perception," and that if, quote, "the detainee dies, you're doing it wrong"? The Gitmo senior JAG officer, Lieutenant Colonel Beaver's response was, "we'll need documentation to protect us." 9 days after that October 2, 2002 meeting, General Dunleavy, the commander of Joint Task Force 170 at Gitmo, sent a memo to U.S. Southern Command requesting authority to use interrogation techniques, which the memo divided into 3 categories of progressively more aggressive techniques. Category 1 was the least aggressive. Category 2 was more so and included the use of stress positions, exploitation of detainee fears such as fear of dogs, removal of clothing, hooding, deprivation of light and sound. Category 3 techniques included techniques like the so-called wet towel treatment or waterboard that was the most aggressive. A legal analysis by Gitmo's staff judge advocate, Lieutenant Colonel Diane Beaver, justifying the legality of the techniques, was sent with that request. On October 25, 2002, General James Hill, the Southcom commander, forwarded General Dunleavy's request to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. 9 days later, the Joint Staff solicited the views of the military services on the Gitmo request. Now, that was October 25th. The military services reacted strongly against using many of the techniques in the Gitmo request. In early November of 2002, in a series of memos, the services identified serious legal concerns with the techniques, and they called urgently for additional analysis. The Air Force cited, quote, "serious concerns regarding the legality of many of the proposed techniques," and stated that, quote, "the techniques described may be subject to challenge as failing to meet the requirements outlined in the military order to treat detainees humanely." The Air Force also called for an in-depth legal review of the request.